se ligaba inmediatamente a aspectos ambientales. Esto ha ido evolucionando. La delegada del semanal del día de ayer, la doctora Vilma, señalaba que cuando surge el tema de la preocupación sobre los objetivos del milenio, y luego como ahora, ellos han ido evolucionando y que no es solamente los objetivos del milenio, como objetivo de desarrollo sostenible. Por lo tanto, se complementa a este pensamiento de cuidar los recursos para las generaciones futuras. Y cuando hablamos de cuidar los recursos para las generaciones futuras, estamos hablando mucho más allá del tema ambiental. Los pilares de la sostenibilidad están orientadas a tres sectores: el sector social, el sector ambiente y el sector económico. Si solo una de ellas sin considerar a su no estaríamos hablando de sostenibilidad. Se corre el riesgo de entrar en el tema de la sostenibilidad como un aspecto meramente cosmético, para decir, tener la etiqueta soy sostenible. Y soy sostenible por ciertos aspectos de esfuerzos ambientales, descuidando los aspectos económicos y los aspectos sociales, o de pronto me preocupo por el aspecto económico, descuidando los aspectos sociales. No es sencillo conseguir este equilibrio, pero decir somos sostenibles tiene que orientarse en estos tres sectores. Por lo tanto, somos una industria, somos una empresa, entonces siempre por el reciclaje, la adecuada disposición de los residuos, el reaprovechamiento que ellos pudieran tener, o dispongo que en mi empresa no hay plástico, o de pronto sí hay plástico, pero que esta problema de material reciclado, por lo tanto, es muy importante, generar menos residuos. O ir por esfuerzos mayores, instalar o parte de la energía que requiere mi empresa, pues la tengo a través de instalación de paneles solares. Son muy buenas prácticas, definitivamente. Y si hacemos un repaso de lo que en temas ambientales se ocurrió en los últimos años, pues nada difícil reconocer que esto ha ido evolucionando. En los años 60, pues las producciones se daban y el tema de aspectos de sostenibilidad, temas ambientales, pues normalmente no estaban considerados. Sin embargo, a partir de los años
¿Ella es Vilma, verdad, Miguel?
cuando ya
Se está mandando.
Empiezan a aparecer en el diario que hacer.
Sí, voy
Su
yo.
nación era el vivir. Muchas empresas, a través de sus sistemas de tratamiento de aguas, retiran sus aguas residuales o bien a través de los emisores, pues disponían sus efluentes, con lo cual, a través de la dilución, lograban, entre comillas, reducir los impactos negativos que la tierra. En los años 80 entra este enfoque de los controles al final del tubo.
Un ejemplo clave en los temas de las industrias alimentarias era de que terminaba un proceso, tomaba muestras del lote producido, lo mandaba a analizar, si estas estaban bien, perfecto, salía a mercado. Si estas estaban mal, no salían al mercado. Pero ya invertí recursos. Y además estoy generando desechos. Ahora existen sistemas mucho más preventivos que permiten evitar justamente que esto suceda. Evita el control al final del tubo. Si implementamos en una industria de alimentos el análisis de peligros y puntos críticos de control, voy a controlar mi proceso en aquellos puntos que implican riesgo para la inocuidad alimentaria. De manera que voy a tener la garantía a través del control en estas partes del proceso que mi producto final es un producto que cumple los estándares que se requieren para poner o para colocar un alimento en el mercado. La que sigue, por favor. Entonces, parte de las estrategias que las empresas que están interesadas en ser innovadoras, en ser reconocidas como empresas sostenibles, han optado también por el ecodiseño. El ecodiseño como proceso de gestión estratégica de ingeniería que se aplica en la etapa inicial del diseño, que minimiza de forma preventiva el impacto de los productos o los servicios a lo largo de su ciclo de vida. Se estima que más del 80% de la carga ambiental de un producto o servicio se define en el momento de diseñar el producto. ¿Y cómo no? Si cuando justamente ayer señalaba en mi intervención sobre la gestión racional de las sustancias químicas, si yo voy a evaluar a través del ciclo de vida de esta sustancia, y si yo opto por materiales cuyas características no son el ser peligrosos o son menos peligrosos, mis emisiones, mis residuos, las liberaciones o efluentes que pudieran generar, y además cuando sale al mercado, su uso por parte del consumidor, su impacto será mucho menor. No podemos olvidar entonces este lema de la cuna a la tumba. El producto y mi proceso interesa no solamente dentro de mi instalación, debe ir mucho más allá de las instalaciones de fabricación. La que sigue, por favor. Quienes han optado como una estrategia de sostenibilidad incursionar en el tema del ecodiseño, hacen este análisis de ciclo de vida como un estudio sistémico, trabajan con ecoindicadores para evaluar el impacto ambiental del proceso, del producto, de la sustancia, ingresan en el diseño de innovación y mejora, y esto va aunado a una certificación y comunicación de las mejoras. La que sigue, por favor. El enfoque de ciclo de vida que están recogidas en normas ISO, lo que permite es ver todas las etapas por las que pasan los productos, servicios o actividades. Y como refería, este es el enfoque de la cuna a la tumba. Los aspectos que importan en este análisis, en este proceso de evaluar cada fase, están orientados a los puntos de mayor impacto ambiental y son también los puntos donde se pueden mejorar sus características, donde se pueden mejorar los procesos. Son los puntos de ineficacia donde uno identifica y donde a su vez va a aplicar las mejoras. La que sigue, por favor. Trabajar en forma sostenible, entonces, no solo significa pagar o compensar parcialmente externalidades negativas de la actividad industrial a través de proyectos altruistas, ¿no? De pronto me siento tranquila yo empresa porque estoy promoviendo las plantaciones de árboles o estoy patrocinando porque voy un poco como para sentirme menos mal de las emisiones que estoy generando al ambiente o de los daños a través de mi producto que pudieran generarse en el consumidor. No es eso solamente la sostenibilidad. Significa ir más allá de la compensación ambiental, que implica respetar el equilibrio entre la dimensión económica y lo social, y entre esta y la protección del ambiente. Obtener beneficios económicos diseñando productos que mejoran la calidad de vida de los clientes, trabajadores, proveedores y comunidad local aporta valor para la sociedad, a la que intenta servir. La que sigue, por favor. La sostenibilidad como estrategia empresarial va más allá entonces del cumplimiento de obligaciones jurídicas, fiscales o laborales. Los países tenemos una serie de regulaciones que están orientadas a regular, a controlar, a prevenir, en algunos casos, la contaminación, a que los aspectos laborales sean tal que el trabajador pueda desempeñar sus labores dentro de un confort, dentro de un estándar de calidad de vida. Pero sostenibilidad entonces no es solo cumplir lo que ya las normas me exigen, es intentar ir más allá. Se trata de invertir entonces en el capital humano, en el entorno y en la relación que existe con los interlocutores. Definitivamente, si hablamos que parte de los pilares de la sostenibilidad es el aspecto económico, entonces esto no supone comprometer la rentabilidad de la empresa. Porque si está en riesgo la rentabilidad de la empresa, ya no estamos hablando de sostenibilidad. La que sigue, por favor. Las industrias entonces tienen que comprender que para mantenerse en el medio y a largo plazo, no pueden ignorar las expectativas de otras partes interesadas, o lo que otros conocen como los stakeholders. Una empresa tiene un dueño, tiene su parte directiva, los socios, pero ¿será que una empresa es solamente, los dueños de esta empresa son solamente los socios? ¿Y los trabajadores? ¿Y qué tal con los familiares de los trabajadores? ¿Y qué tal con los proveedores de materias primas? ¿Y qué tal con el consumidor? ¿Qué pasa si dejamos de consumir determinado producto? ¿Será entonces que la empresa tiene como dueños solamente a sus socios? No. Las empresas subsisten en el mercado porque hay un público que requiere de sus productos y que requiere de sus servicios. Y cuando este público no está de acuerdo con estos servicios, con estos productos, deja de consumirlos. Entonces las empresas tenemos que pensar un poco más en estos otros actores. Estar interesados no desde nuestras oficinas pensando qué le gustará al público, sino interactuando mucho más con ellos. Definitivamente tendrán que ser muy inteligentes para ver cuáles son los mejores mecanismos para conocer el sentir del público consumidor, cuál es el interés de sus proveedores, de sus trabajadores y de los familiares de los trabajadores. Se crea así el compromiso de una conducción ética del negocio, a la par que los sectores económicos y sociales demandan prácticas empresariales acreditadas con la gestión sostenible del negocio. La que sigue, por favor. ¿Qué características, entonces, se podrían señalar que corresponden a una empresa sostenible versus a las características que predominaban en lo que corresponde a una empresa convencional? Una empresa convencional, su objetivo es maximizar el beneficio para sus accionistas. La empresa sostenible maximiza la creación de riqueza para la sociedad en la que opera, creando productos y servicios. Una empresa convencional cumple con las reglas de juego. La empresa sostenible aprovecha las oportunidades que la mejora de la calidad de vida ofrece para sus negocios. Una empresa convencional atiende las demandas de información a través, por ejemplo, del etiquetado y de la información que puede dar de sus productos. Una empresa sostenible favorece la participación de la sociedad en la compañía para buscar conjuntamente soluciones. Una empresa convencional considera que las nuevas responsabilidades deben conllevar leyes que se deben hacer cumplir por todos. La empresa sostenible considera que las nuevas responsabilidades la diferencian y cuanto menos reglas, mejor. Porque no es algo que lo obligan, no es algo que le imponen, es algo que está convencido que se tiene que hacer. Por lo tanto, las reacciones en una empresa convencional por lo general son reactivas, en tanto que en una empresa sostenible son acciones de líderes. La que sigue, por favor. Cuando hablamos entonces de la importancia de relación con los interesados o con los stakeholders, se refiere a que hay que considerar las necesidades y requerimientos de personas y organizaciones que tienen influencia o interés en las actividades que desarrolla la empresa. La empresa sostenible es capaz de construir relaciones fructuosas con las partes interesadas y desde esta nueva perspectiva, la misión de la empresa es encontrar oportunidades que resulten beneficiosas tanto para ella como para la comunidad. La siguiente, por favor. Una empresa sostenible piensa en la innovación, la necesidad de producir manteniendo o incrementando la rentabilidad, mejorando el impacto de su actividad sobre la sociedad y reduciendo el efecto negativo sobre el ambiente que pudieran generarse de sus procesos. Implica un cambio y este cambio se rige por la capacidad de innovar. La innovación, entendida como resultado de la investigación básica y aplicada y del desarrollo, se ha convertido en una condición para el éxito empresarial. Y qué importante cuando hablamos de innovación, considerar que las entidades de investigación, las entidades académicas, ¿cómo pueden participar de este proceso? Yo presumo que muchas universidades, y no debe ser ajena a la Universidad de San Luis Potosí, de que parte de su desarrollo de las actividades es permitir el acceso a practicantes o a tesistas. Y este acercamiento podría permitir a su vez de que las industrias formen parte de una manera más activa en el proceso de desarrollo de estas prácticas o de estas tesis, investigando sobre los temas que le interesan, investigando en procesos innovativos, investigando en productos que a la comunidad le interesan. La industria tiene los recursos. Invirtiendo en procesos de investigación a través de tesistas o estudiantes universitarios, va a tener la oportunidad. No solo gana el alumno, no solo gana la universidad, no solo gana la empresa, ganan todos. Este acercamiento es el que se debe buscar cada vez más. A veces en algunos países las investigaciones se realizan de manera desconectada con las necesidades del país. Y no está mal que se haga investigación, pero si estas no responden a las necesidades de lo que el país, de lo que la localidad, de lo que la industria requiere, pues van a quedar muy bonitos empastados en las bibliotecas de las universidades. Cuando esta es una oportunidad de aportar mucho más al desarrollo de su comunidad, al desarrollo de su país. La que sigue, por favor. Y como el aspecto social involucra también a las relaciones laborales, en una empresa sostenible, los empleados y sus familias forman parte también del grupo de nuevos propietarios. Como tal, la alta dirección debe compartir con ellos los valores y objetivos coherentes con el desarrollo sostenible de la empresa. Empleados motivados e integrados en los proyectos de la empresa constituyen una fuerza productiva valiosa, capaz de aportar mejoras en las líneas estratégicas de la organización. En el polo opuesto, relaciones laborales deshumanizadas engendran desinterés por el proyecto entre los empleados. Y solamente trabajo porque, bueno, me van a dar un sueldo. Porque no tengo otra alternativa, porque es lo único que me permite llevar el sustento a mi hogar. No hay un compromiso, no lo sienten suyo, lo sienten ajeno. Y parte de la sostenibilidad es lograr que lo sientan propio. Porque si la empresa no va, si la empresa deja de producir productos de interés en el consumidor, la empresa puede cerrar. Y si la empresa cierra, me quedo sin empleo. Pero bueno, posiblemente el trabajador diga, buscaré otro. las cosas no están fáciles, pero buscaré otro. Entonces, hay que optar por ese compromiso laboral de ser integrante de la empresa, como si fuera un dueño más. Finalmente, por favor, la siguiente. Entonces, como conclusiones, tenemos que los retos han dado lugar a la necesidad de orientar el crecimiento hacia un modelo de desarrollo sostenible que satisfaga las necesidades de las generaciones actuales sin comprometer las generaciones futuras. La sostenibilidad ofrece la oportunidad para las empresas que desean tener éxito como organizaciones que generan valor para la sociedad en la que operan. El ambiente no es visto como una amenaza y los problemas ambientales son una oportunidad para hacer las cosas mejor, como una cuestión estratégica más allá de su sistema de gestión o del cumplimiento de la ley. Con ello, la que sigue, por favor. El personal de la empresa debe ser parte de la contribución del desarrollo sostenible de aquella empresa que quiere ser realmente sostenible. Y una industria sostenible deberá caminar necesariamente hacia el equilibrio entre el crecimiento económico, la protección del ambiente y de sus recursos y el desarrollo de una sociedad más justa. Muchas gracias.
Le agradecemos a Vilma.
Hello, good morning everybody. So we will switch to English now. And I have the pleasure to introduce Karen Sudmeier Rieux. She's from Switzerland, from Lausanne. Actually, she's not, because she's actually half from the US and half from Sweden. But she has been living in France for quite a long time, working in Geneva and Lausanne. So her background, she has a PhD in environmental sciences, a master's in international development, and another one in forest ecology. She's working as a senior researcher at University of Lausanne, particularly working on risk management and resilience, so pretty close related to the Sustainable Development Goals. And apart from her research, which she's conducting particularly in Nepal, in Asia, and also in Pakistan, she's working as a consultant for the United Nations Environmental Programme and for IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature. So she published a lot of articles related to risk reduction, particularly related to ecosystem-based risk reduction. And that is her topic now. So a warm welcome to Karen, please.
Buenos días, good morning everybody. Es mi primera vez en Mexico, and that's all the Spanish I will say. To prevent a disaster, I will not speak more than that, because every time I try to open my mouth in Spanish, somebody says, "Hey lady, you speak English." No, let's speak English instead. So I'm delighted to be here today, and I would like to thank the organizers, Dr. Patricia Julio, Dr. Udo Naren. I'd like to thank Miguel Navarro for having been such a good guide, and to all of you for being here today. So, like I said, although this is my first time in Mexico, I was born in Los Angeles, not far from Mexico. I never had the opportunity to visit. So this is really a lovely city. I've already gained 3 kilos by eating such very good food. And I feel very humbled to be invited to Latin America to speak about disasters. As a child growing up in Los Angeles, I only really, I would say, experienced one major disaster. Waking up one day to a very strong earthquake, falling out of bed, seeing the television move, hearing the glasses making this jingle noise was very scary. And as an adult, I realized that it was a 6.5 magnitude earthquake, and 65 people died during that event. It crumbled a major highway where most people died, and bridges, and resulted in new building codes for preventing further disasters. So I realized that we'd all rather not live through any more disasters and try to prevent them as much as possible. Now, you've already been sitting here listening to our previous speaker, and I would like to ask you in this room, how many of you have already experienced one disaster in your life? You can either stand up or raise your hand. How many of you have experienced one disaster? Okay. How many of you have experienced two disasters in your life? A couple hands. Our Indonesian colleagues are not in the room. I think for Indonesian colleagues, are you here? One there, okay. How many of you, come in, don't be shy. How many of you, good, we have the Indonesian contingents, where I'm waiting for you to come to answer this question. How many of you have experienced 2 or 3 disasters or more in your lifetime? Okay. Now, of course, what you might consider a disaster may not be the same thing as somebody else considers a disaster. A 6.5 magnitude earthquake in Los Angeles would not be considered a disaster in Japan, for example, where probably there would be no deaths due to a 6.5 magnitude earthquake. Now, one more question I will ask you. How many of you work in natural resources or in the natural resources field? Raise your hands. Okay. Or study it, or would like to be part of it. Okay, about half. Okay. How many of you work in disaster management? Or something related to that? A little bit fewer. How many work in both? Okay. So for those of you who have experienced 2 or more disasters and work in both, I invite you to come up here and give my keynote talk because I think you're more qualified than me. That means Tanya, for example, and some other people. No? Okay. All right. Well, I'll do my best anyway. So the title of my topic is Ecosystems and Disasters. Why do they matter? And especially for sustainable development. Let's see if this works. So I will keep it simple. I will keep it to 3 main parts of the presentation. Why do disasters matter to sustainable development? Why do ecosystems matter to reducing disasters? And how can we link ecosystems, disaster reduction, and sustainable development? And I will have 3 main messages, well, 3.5 messages. So please stay around to the end where you hear my half message also. Hopefully you'll stay awake through that also. First part. My first message is unsustainable development is the main driver of disaster risk, not climate change. So let's take an example from the country where I live, France. Cyclone Xynthia in 2010 happened along the coast. 68 people died, 29 in one village called Faute-sur-Mer. And now it's a very curious name because faute means mistake. So the name of the town is actually the mistake on the sea. And it really was a mistake. They built all of these houses behind a 200-year-old sea dike. There were $200 billion in damages. Why? Was this climate change? Okay, maybe the cyclone was a little bit higher magnitude, but the scientists actually are not in agreement as to whether cyclones are actually increasing in magnitude and frequency. The main problem was the development, poor land use planning. These houses were built behind a 200-year-old dike. It provided false security. And afterwards, people didn't want to move. They didn't want to relocate. The government had to buy them out against their will, money that could have been spent for other things, such as sustainable development. Let's go to Haiti. Tropical storm Jeanne in 2004 caused over 6,000 deaths in Haiti, 18 deaths in Dominican Republic, lots of damages throughout the whole region, including the United States. So 7 billion also come from the damages caused to the Florida coast. The 18 casualties in Dominican Republic, those are people mainly living along the border between Haiti and Dominican Republic. This is what the border looks like. Now, was this disaster caused by climate change? I would say it's probably due to poor natural resource management. It's due to poor governance, poverty, unsustainable development. One more example. Indian Ocean tsunami caused many, many casualties in 14 countries. I don't think they've even calculated the damages. On my last line kind of slipped down there over the night, but it should say $14 billion in humanitarian aid. Now, of course, climate change does not cause tsunamis, we know that, but we do know that human activity makes disasters worse. This is an example, and this is a slide from Miguel. I hope he's here. I promised to show him a slide, and he's not here. It's about tourism and unsustainable tourism practices. What you see on the top is a photo from Yala National Park. There's some nice sand dunes there. What's hard to see is there's an ecotourism resort that's hidden behind the sand dunes, and when the tsunami hit this part of Sri Lanka, there was only 5 centimeters of water in the resort and no deaths. Not far down the coast is the Yala Safari Resort. They cut down the sand dunes for better views. Well, guess what? They had 7 meters of water and 27 people died. That has to do with human activity making disasters worse. And I'm sure you can come up with your own examples. It comes down to sustainable tourism and sustainable development. Okay, I'm going to throw a couple of statistics at you, not too much, but still a little bit. So actually, there's some good news. It's good to have good news so early in the morning, right? The good news is that actually there are fewer people affected by disasters in the world. Although this is very roller coaster statistics, but overall, there are also fewer deaths. There's still quite a few, right? There's still quite a few people affected, but overall, governments are actually doing a better job at giving early warning, evacuation, and reducing the number of people that are dying. However, what we see is, look at this, economic losses are increasing. Now, why is that? I'll explain that in a couple more minutes. Just think about that. How is it possible? Okay, a couple of definitions. I cannot help being a professor and having to give a couple definitions. But since many of you are from natural resources, maybe disaster risk is a little bit new. So I apologize for whom this is really not new at all. But according to the definition given by UNISDR, which is the United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, and the main UN agency working in this field, these are their definitions. There are others given by IPCC, for example, but we tend to stick to these definitions. So what's a disaster? It's a serious disruption of society which goes beyond local coping capacities. So what might be a disaster in Indonesia may not be a disaster in Japan. What may be a disaster in Sweden will probably be not considered a disaster in Indonesia. So this is a little bit up to interpretation. There are some standard criteria that you can look up on their website, but I'm not going to go in those in detail. What is risk? I'll be talking about that more. The potential disaster losses, okay? What will happen in the future? And we tend to look at risk in terms of 3 elements: hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. By the way, Udo, you wave at me when there's 10 minutes left, okay? So that I don't get carried away. Oh, come on. We're Mexico, but I'm still working in Switzerland. I need to, okay, so please tell me when 10 minutes is getting there. Okay, let's look at hazards, the first part of this equation. Well, there are many different kinds of hazards. Geophysical, I need to move to the next one. So we have geophysical, earthquakes, tsunamis, volcano eruptions. I think we have a couple of famous volcanologists in the room here. I'm sure many of you are working on earthquakes. Hydrometeorological, storms, flooding, landslides that are rain-induced at least. Landslides can also be considered geophysical if they're earthquake-induced. Climatological, heat waves, cold spells. And societal, technological, or industrial. Now, we tend to, before we used to talk about natural disasters versus man-made or technological. Although you saw my many examples, how many of those disasters were actually natural? Most of them had some aspect of man-made or woman-made, but mainly man-made, I think. And so we're actually not using the term natural disasters anymore. Many of them are unnatural. So we tend to think we used to call these also natural hazards, but many of these are also getting affected by climate change. So now even in the official terminology, I think they're dropping natural hazards and using physical hazards, okay? We need to think about also what are intensive risks. Intensive risks are the very quick, sudden risk, hazards, okay? Landslides, storms, and so forth. Extensive is more long, like heat waves, the ones that take a long time to happen. So climate change oftentimes deals more with extensive risks. And what the scientists are saying is that for now, they only have scientific evidence that heat waves and sea level rise are caused by climate change. Some extreme rainfall events are caused by climate change. All of the other hazards for now are not having been confirmed as being caused by climate change. Some of this, there's some differences in regions, but if you read their report, they're quite good at making explanations about how they come to those conclusions. Let's go to exposure. This is a photo that, two satellite images, one of eastern Nepal and a city called Dharan from 2004. We were studying landslides, but we also saw, we looked at the riverbank, and then we compared with the photo from 2009, and we said, my goodness, look at all those people who've moved into the floodplain. And we interviewed many of them. There are 200 households that had moved there in 5 years. Many of them have come from the hillsides because they had experienced landslides. They had no employment, so they came there for better jobs and education for their families. And they knew there would be flooding, and they decided to take that risk because the risk of not eating the next day or the next month was higher than the flood risk. So this is called exposure, which means elements at risk present in a hazard zone and subject to potential losses. Now, flood came through here last year and created a lot of devastation. Again, would that be due to climate change? No, this is unsustainable development once again. Exposure. And exposure is actually the main driving force behind risk. Finally, vulnerability, the last part of the risk equation. Here's a little bit too much text here. Vulnerability is more, I would say, the least easy variable to measure because it can be done in a physical way, looking at house structures, or looking at socioeconomics, looking at GDP or literacy rates. And there are also different definitions between the US, different UN agencies. Between IPCC, they define a little bit differently from UNISDR. I almost got into a fist fight once with a lady who was very strongly opposed to the way how I was defining vulnerability, but it's okay. It's okay to have different definitions as long as we know the purpose. Why then is risk of disasters increasing worldwide? Well, we just said that according to IPCC, this is actually quite constant or cyclical, except for sea level rise and for heat waves and some floods. All the other ones are actually quite constant. That's not the main driving factor. Vulnerability around the world is actually improving, mainly led to some of the big emerging countries like China, Brazil, who are actually making improvements in vulnerability. Now, that's not the case for all countries, but some of the big countries are leading in terms of reducing vulnerability. What is increasing is the exposure. It's our photo from Nepal. It's people living in dangerous places and places with poor land use management. Second part. So why do ecosystems matter to reducing disasters? Second message is, unfortunately, often we need a disaster to start preventing the next one. And sometimes disasters create windows of opportunity for prevention. Now let's look at Mexico, or Tropical Storm Stan, which not only affected Mexico, but 7 other countries. There were lots of casualties, huge amount of damages. And I would like to give you one example of an opportunity that opened up after Tropical Storm Stan. It's a project, IWRM means Integrated Water Resource Management. IUCN, which is the International Union for Conservation of Nature, they had a conservation project which was wiped out by this Tropical Storm Stan. And they decided they needed to actually start thinking about disaster risk reduction, which is not traditionally part of what a conservation organization does. But to protect their investment, what they did was they worked with over 100 communities. This is actually working in a watershed that is also bordering with Mexico and Chiapas, I think. Women constituted 90% of the groups, and they developed a micro-watershed council to repair damaged slopes, promote agroforestry, early warning, and water management. So they integrated what you traditionally do for natural resources management, and something that's not traditional is early warning and some of these more simple disaster risk management things. They combine these kind of two separate worlds together to make a more comprehensive approach to both conservation and disaster risk reduction. So this shows the map they had of these micro watersheds. So it was a water management project, but they realized that they had to incorporate the disaster communications, damage assessments, and donor coordination after the 2005 disaster. And it became a model for the National Micro Watershed Commission in Guatemala. It was the first example of transboundary governance for sharing information between country agencies. So here's basically one of my main messages of this talk is getting those separate worlds to work together. And here's one example of doing that. Let me give you some more examples about how ecosystems can play a role in disaster risk reduction. Well, wetlands, they can be good pockets for absorbing excess water, for buffering flooding. This is a photo I took last week in Switzerland. We were at a conference for disaster risk reduction. In Switzerland, they're very good at protecting their forests for avalanche and landslide protection. And they actually pay the landowners not to cut their trees, and landowners are not allowed to cut their trees without permission. It's very carefully managed. This is from Thailand, mangroves. There have been a lot of studies after the Indian Ocean tsunami looking at mangroves. And actually, it was only thanks to the Indian Ocean tsunami that people really started studying the role of mangroves for disaster risk reduction. Now, of course, tsunamis is such a huge, the tsunami that was witnessed in Sri Lanka was of such huge magnitude that many of the mangroves were wiped out, let's be honest. But most of the frequently reoccurring hazards, like coastal surges and waves, mangroves can be very efficient in protecting the coast against that. This is a nice slide made by Udo. So what are some of these ecosystem services that can be used that are important for disaster risk reduction? Regulating services, especially. These buffering services. But then we have so many other ecosystem services that are very useful for sustainable development. And I will get back to the multiple benefits and the no regret strategy for investing in ecosystems. For human well-being, healthy ecosystems, disaster resilience, and adaptation through the efficient use of ecosystem services. So I should introduce what this terrible acronym is. So what we're saying is that an ecosystem-based approach to disaster risk reduction is exactly this, protecting these various ecosystems to protect people and provide livelihoods support. This is what we mean by ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction. And ecosystem-based adaptation is looking at more long-term solutions to climate change, such as drought-resistant crops, for example. So these acronyms will follow us through the rest of the presentation, so just try to, hopefully don't have too many acronyms, but these two you might want to remember, please. Sometimes we need, some areas you cannot protect with ecosystems alone, especially densely populated areas. You need some hard infrastructure. You need sometimes to combine the gray and the green. We call them hybrid approaches. But what we need to be careful with and work with our civil engineers, like Dr. Ali, we have to make sure that we don't disturb the ecosystem and make more harm than good when we put in gray infrastructure. And it's possible to do both, especially when you're working with good civil engineers. So what I want to say is that ecosystem-based DRR, or eco-DRR and EBA, they can act on all three components of the risk equation. They can prevent or mitigate the hazards, right? We saw the protection forests. They can reduce exposure, for example, in areas where we put in green belts along coasts, so people don't live so close to the coast wherever possible. We have a green belt instead. And third, and very importantly for sustainable development, of course, we know that natural resources or ecosystems support livelihoods before, during, and after disasters. So even if no disaster happens, even if there's no hazard that happens in a place, people still have the ecosystems for their livelihoods. So what we call a no regrets strategy. So I just want to give you a couple of ideas. I'm not going to go through these, a couple of ideas of the tools and approaches that are quite typically natural resource management approaches. Integrated coastal zone management, water resource management, protected area management, fire management, sustainable management. You're saying to me, what does this have to do with disaster risk reduction? These are typical natural resource management tools. Yes, but if we do like they did in Takana, we can add that early warning component. We can add this disaster risk reduction component that we don't normally do when we're doing all of these natural resource management tools. But it requires that you go out and find the other guys in the room who wave their hands that they're working on disaster risk reduction. You start working with them and you start doing combined risk mapping and ecosystem services mapping. It might be a little bit tricky in the beginning to make this marriage work, but in the long run, it will be much more productive. Cross-cutting issues are community-based natural resources and risk management, spatial planning, EIAs and SCAs, right? Environmental impact assessments. Okay? Now, eco-DRR is also more cost-effective over the long run. Here's an example from New York City, where their sewer system was getting so old they had to replace it. And they made a big study and they compared how much it would cost to do green infrastructure renewal, wetlands, planting more trees, green sidewalks, green roofs, versus the gray infrastructure, the normal way of doing it. And it was actually cheaper to do it the green way, plus all the added benefits of cooler city, better aesthetics, and so forth. So they decided to go with the green way. And look, over time, the green infrastructure only gets better, and the gray infrastructure, you have to replace it after 15 years. Now, can we say that ecosystems will protect from any hazard? No, we cannot. It depends on the type and intensity of the hazard. It depends on the health and composition of ecosystems. Requires the correct technical expertise. And often, like I said before, we need to combine solutions, ecosystem solutions with hard infrastructure. But then again, such a huge magnitude tsunami, not even the seawalls could protect. And actually many people died, some people died by going up to see the tsunami coming because they were so sure that the seawall would protect them. So sometimes we have false security with these infrastructures, and they also will fail, depending on the hazard. Third and last part, how can we link ecosystems, disaster risk reduction, and sustainable development? I think I've already given some hints, but I will conclude that eco-DRR and EBA are no-regret strategies that are starting to gain attention, but there's more work ahead. This is a nice slide put together by Udo also. There's so many bubbles here. But basically what this says is that we have some main targets for ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction and adaptation, including disaster prevention and recovery, hazard mitigation, climate change adaptation. But look at all these additional benefits we get. Even if the storm never comes, we still get support for sustainable livelihoods, heritage and culture, water and soil protection, stabilization of regional climate, biodiversity, carbon sequestration. How can we lose? There's starting to be more attention paid to ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction and EBA, fortunately. There's been mention of it in the IPC report, which is a very good one, Managing the Risk of Extreme Events. I managed to write 800 words in this report on ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction. Was very happy that it made it to the publication. The climate change conference and protocol are taking up EBA. Sustainable development goals have included disaster risk reduction. And the next big conference on disaster risk reduction, it's very important, will be coming up next year in Sendai, where there will be a new negotiation of targets for disaster risk reduction, and ecosystem-based eco-DRR is hopefully on the agenda there. Now, I will end with some opportunities that I would encourage you to seize. Here in Mexico, I was just learning that you have something called Fonden, which is a natural disaster fund. I was talking with Patti about this, and it was established in the late 1990s. A certain percent of your national budget goes to this fund, right? About 800 million US per year. Now, the emphasis is still reconstruction, public infrastructure, low-income housing, but the natural environment is also listed there. And I've never seen that actually in such a national fund, to have both the disaster reduction and the environmental function. And there's some in prevention activities that are supposed to take place. Now, I guess maybe it looks better on paper than in actuality. I don't know, I'm not a specialist of that, but at least for you to know about this and maybe take better advantage of this fund, which is quite unique, actually. You should be quite lucky to have this. Yesterday, I was on the phone with a good friend who told me, well, you know, Karen, I just was working in disaster risk reduction. I just started working in environmental management, and I'm trying to figure out how to put the two together. And she said, you know, in Colombia, we just had a very interesting risk management law. Is anybody from Colombia here? Okay. So maybe you can, a couple of people, good. Well, you're lucky because you have really innovative law that was passed in 2012. And it's about integrated risk management, where risk management is a social process for sustainable development. And what she is working on, my friend, is looking at territorial planning for territory in southern Colombia. And she's combining data on risk factors with ecosystem services. That's very innovative. She says, I'm really tired though, because people don't want to work together. That's my main job, is getting those people to work together and sit in the same room and collaborate. So here's a challenge for you. How can you make it happen? Sustainable development is really our overall goal. We have ecosystem management, disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation. We're working on various aspects of this, right? Everybody in the room was working on some aspect of this. But how can you reach out and bridge your institutional gaps, bridge our university discipline gaps, and work together, because that's what it comes down to. It just makes common sense. So here's a challenge for you. And I will just end up by giving a little bit of promotion. I would like you to join one of our courses if you're looking for more information on how you can bridge these gaps and be more actors of change. We have a master's course for universities that's free, that we worked on very hard with CNRD, and we're very thankful for their support in developing these products. So any university professors interested, you can come to me. I have a couple of our training manuals with me for those who are really interested, and it's very easy to receive all of the course materials. And then secondly, we have a massive open online course starting in November, and I have some brochures here, and you can sign up online or come and see me. And we have where's the website? Website is listed there. And we're also working, I would give a little bit of advertisement to this. It's a global alliance of 17 international organizations, UN organizations, universities, working together to bridge science and policy to get this topic into global and national and local level policies. So I thank you very much, and hope to talk to you more during the break, and any questions are welcome. Thank you.
Yes, thanks a lot, Karen, for that very interesting, comprehensive presentation. We have quite a time left, so please, let's go ahead for some questions. Yeah?
I think we have a microphone that goes around.
Maybe I can take the microphone. I don't know who. Oh.
It's just a comment. Besides this fund, the fund that the Mexican government has, there is another fund, which is for prevention. We have another fund which is named FOPREDEN, which is the fund for the disaster prevention. And the interesting thing for this fund is that this fund is available for the states, not for persons, it's just for the governments of states. And the main way to get funds for this, or the rule to get the funds, is that every state should produce risk inventory of the state. Once this has been done, the federation gives money to solve the problems that have been highlighted by the risk assessment in the state. So I think this is also another very good tool that is currently working in Mexico.
Okay. What is the name of that? Thank you for the information.
FOPREDEN, FOPREDEN.
And are there any, do you have any examples of uses of this prevention fund that invest in natural resources management?
Yes, there are several.
Okay.
The interesting thing is that the cases that have been successful are not very well known. The failures are well known.
Okay. Thank you. That's very good information to know
Thank
about.
you. Where was the next? I forgot, but there was somebody here. Or behind me? No? Any other questions? It's a little early, maybe.
Oh, I can talk more. I can go on and on and on. I was trying to stick to
Karen,
the...
we start with some
I was...
gymnastics, so maybe we can do some wake-up sports and... No? No more questions? Suggestions?
How many of you feel that you're doing EcoDR already and this is nothing new? How many of you are already combining disaster risk reduction and ecosystem management? Yeah? Can you explain what you're doing, Tanya?
She's faster.
Now I came up question, not
Okay.
what I'm doing. I mean, I'm working related on climate change, but following the negotiations. But at the office, they are doing some risk management. But what I would like to ask, if something that I'm not pretty sure, even though I have been in Udo's module and everything, is like, how do we differentiate between eco-DDR and climate change adaptation?
Okay.
Where is the barrier
Okay.
between both?
Yeah, I didn't put in that slide because I was afraid that I would make you fall asleep by then. But we have, I think a good way of explaining it is looking at the type of hazard, three things, the type of hazard. Now, earthquakes fall outside of what would be considered climate change, right? Volcanoes also, right? Tsunamis. Okay, so we have some hazards that we really do not consider to be affected by climate change, okay? But in disaster risk reduction, of course, we look at those, right? Second is the time scale. Often in disaster risk reduction, we look at kind of immediate time scale. We are less good at incorporating uncertainty and over the long term, whereas it's true that the climate change community is looking more long term and incorporating uncertainty as well, right? And then the third is the kind of, I would say, different responses that are given and different institutions. So for example, in disaster risk reduction, we tend to look at mitigation measures. And the word mitigation is used differently in the two communities, so I really shouldn't use that word. But we tend to look at, how to reduce the immediate risks. And climate change tends to look at measures such as drought prevention or drought, water management long term. Right? So it has to do with the time frame, the type of hazard, and the type of measure. And then the problem is different institutions. So I would say that there's an overlap by at least 80% between the two, but we're working in completely different worlds, which is causing a problem because we're not coordinating that well. Now, ecosystem responses can actually be a good bridge between both because they can be very good for long-term planning, for drought management, right? For example, integrated water resources management. And they can also be very good for immediate disaster risk reduction by doing early warning, flood alert systems and so forth. So even though there's a huge gap between climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction, ecosystems can actually be a good bridge between the two because it can do both the long term and depending on how it's done, it can also act more short term. Was that okay? Explanation? Okay.
Okay.
Any others who are working on, who has an EcoDRR project here, who didn't call it that, but you actually have one? I mean, who's working in water resources management and incorporates some aspect of disaster risk?
Sometimes I would like to say I work in the area of disasters, but I don't work on that. I mainly work on the previous step, which is the prevention. So, and I think many people here could be in the same situation. Many people work to prevent disasters, working mainly in the hazards and risks evaluations. So in my case, I work in the hazards assessment of geological processes, and currently I am working on the National Committee of the National Scientific Assessment Committee for the National System of Civil Protection. It's a very long name, I'm sorry, but it is interesting how things have been developing with time. I think after 1985, after the earthquakes that Mexico experienced in that time, the evolution on how to face the natural phenomena has been changing with the time. And now all these scientific committees, there are four, for geological processes, hydrometeorological processes, chemical, chemical,
Technological
okay, chemical phenomena, and also another one for social. I don't remember how's the name of that other committee, but the people in these committees are actually part of the other committees, like the ones of the funds you mentioned, for the Fonden and the FOPREDEN.
Okay.
And then when there is a request for this kind of economic resources, all these people try to assess the Mexican government how to distribute the money. So in that way, I think I will say that I'm working in preventing the disasters, but I don't work after the disaster. Mainly the people of Fonden are working once a disaster is occurring. They react with providing the budget to make the places that have been affected to recover.
Yeah. I think in Mexico you're lucky, because in most countries in the world it's mainly post-disaster, and there's actually very little work on prevention, because it's more difficult to get political, I would say, backing to invest in prevention than it is to reconstruct. It's much easier also to go out and build a seawall and have a nice photo opportunity with a politician going out and cutting the ribbon on a nice seawall than it is to go out and plant trees, which might take a couple of years to grow. What are you going to cut a ribbon on, planting the trees? It's less politically, I would say, attractive. But that's very good if in Mexico that you are able to work on prevention and you have found some funding. But it happened only because you had many disasters in the past, right? Probably leading to these funds. And what's happening now in Philippines, actually, after the big cyclone Haiyan, is that they're actually doing a huge green reconstruction program that looks at sustainable livelihoods and mangrove restoration. But it was only because they had the huge cyclone that they were able to start investing in some of these prevention activities. So sometimes we have to wait to get funding. From the post-disaster funding is huge oftentimes, and then you can use that funding to start investing in prevention. But if Mexico, you have, I would say, a more progressive fund for this, that's good. So take advantage of that.
Okay.
We have somebody from Indonesia. Udo?
Yes, please.
Okay, I would like to ask about, you mentioned about the social process in the Colombia risk management law, your slide, okay.
Yeah.
From your experience, how the significance of the social process for the success of DRR, eco-DRR?
Okay. So the question is how to include the social process into successful disaster risk reduction. Is that right? Yes. Well, I can give an example from Nepal, where I'm working with communities who are themselves building their roads. And I gave an interview yesterday for the local radio here that explored that in quite a lot of detail. So basically, the communities in Nepal are getting, collecting money either from revenue from community forestry or from out-migration and remittances being sent back. They get a bulldozer. They decide, well, I'm going to build a road connecting my village with the upper part, and they build their own road with a bulldozer. Now, the problem is that when they get 4,000 to 5,000 millimeters of rainfall in 3 months, and the geology is quite weak, what happens is that you have lots of erosion, gullying, and I would say lots of economic losses because of the agricultural fields get buried, right? I'm telling a long story here, but to kind of explain why it's important to have the social process. So working with them and trying to improve the way roads are built, if you don't have community, I would say, involvement, it's just not going to be sustainable. Any kind of disaster measure that works, that requires the involvement of the local community will never be sustainable. Because government cannot do anything, especially in Nepal, the government has very low capacity. The government has no capacity to do anything about these roads. It's all the community action. And I'm sure you have examples of that from Indonesia also. A lot of these mangroves plantations or any kind of reforestation will not be sustainable unless it's in the interest of the community to maintain the plants. And often it's the local community who can do flood warning, for example, through cell phones or through low-cost technology. The upstream community can alert the downstream community when a flood is coming, and it can be very effective, but the community needs to be involved and to have an interest in that. What was the most challenging part of our project in Nepal was an open grazing area that was so degraded because it was the traditional open grazing area. They didn't want to give it up. And we started saying, yes, but if we make some plantations here, this house down below will be protected. And finally they were convinced. It took a lot of meetings with them, and finally they were convinced and decided to expand the area that they would plant by actually 3 times bigger than what we had proposed. And it was thanks to the community involvement that this project is now being more successful, and they're reducing the risk of erosion thanks to their plantation and their involvement and their maintenance. Without their involvement, this project would not work at all.
Yes, one more, Anushka.
I have a question about risk perception and eco-DRR, because I think that a lot of the projects we could implement and that we are implementing are usually from top to bottom, because there is a specific risk or there has been a disaster, so then government decides, or there is always an NGO who wants to help, and then we have a project, and if there is no community involvement, if there is no community need, or if people don't really have a perception of their risk because they think, oh, it's a punishment of God, or oh, this has always been the case here, there is no really not a problem, it's what we have always lived with, then how can these kind of projects be successful? So is there a way of integrating risk perception as well into eco-DRR?
Okay. Yeah, the issue of risk perception is very interesting and something that I've also studied. It's not particular to eco-DRR, but it goes for any kind of risk situation. You know, when I started working in Nepal as a young 40-year-old doing my PhD there, I was convinced that landslides, because we studied landslide-affected communities, landslide must be their biggest problem, right? Because half their lands are just washed away by the landslides. But I'd go in and do a household survey and focus groups and talk to the women and the men, and they'd say, you know, I asked, what is your main concern? And they said, well, actually, it's we don't have access to a road, or we don't have employment, or the women have no, education. And I'm like, what about the landslide? Yeah, I know. I mean, it did wash away half of our lands, but we're actually more concerned about access to a road so we can bring our products to the market. So when you come in with a project from outside, you may think that people are mainly concerned about a flood or other landslide. It's often the livelihoods are their main risk. And so you have to keep that in mind. If you're doing a project looking at stabilizing landslides, you also have to think about having some part of that project that addresses their main risks, which is livelihoods. So that, for example, in Nepal, what we're doing with the plantations is, yes, we're planting grasses with very deep roots for the stabilization, but we're also giving out lots of fodder trees, lots of fruit trees, putting together, developing a nursery that will be run by a mother's group, so they can sell some of the fruit trees for their own, livelihoods. For some women who had no education, nothing, no livelihoods, and then combining both. So for talking about an eco-DR project, risk perception is very important. It's very important that social scientists work with geologists, for example, and understand what are the main concerns, what are the main priorities, which may be different from what we think. It's not the landslide, it's the food. And then if you're doing a landslide mitigation project, you need to include the food security as part of that. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Karen. I think we have to keep the time.
Okay.
Please give another applause for Karen. And
I will put these flyers up on one of the benches, and I'll put a sign-up sheet and some cards. So if you want to contact me about either the MOOC or the master's course, if you're a university professor, please do so, and I will respond when I get to my office next week. Okay, thank you.
And please stay here for another 2 minutes for 2 announcements, one from Kati and one from me. The first one is, if you go out here, the ramp, turn left, there will be people watching you, taking photos, making videos, asking you something about the conference. That's all. And, Kati?
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Hola, good morning to everybody. I would like to say thank you to Karen and Vilma for their interesting presentation. In the name of the scientific committee, thank you so much for your time and the space you did in your agenda for these conferences. Only to finish this first part of this second day of the conference, I invite you to go to the rooms for the sessions. Some of you that you are going to present in the specific session, please upload your presentation in the computers. We have some minutes before to start the room session, please. So in the room 1 and the room 2 are in this same floor, is for the session Sustainable Consumption and Industrial Production. The room 2 is Water Management. The other rooms are Disaster Risk Reduction is in the second floor, and also other subjects related to the conference in the second floor. So please go to the room sessions, upload your presentation to begin in time, please, and welcome to the conference.
Just one announcement, please, for excursions. The depart for the excursions is going to be tomorrow from here, not from Agenda Ambiental, at 2 o'clock tomorrow. And if you are interested